back or what?
That's a good question. I want to make clear that you may donate red cells once every 8 weeks. If you're donating 2 red cells at one time, you will likely be deferred for 16 weeks. If you're donating platelets, you can actually do that a couple of times a week because we don't take the red cell mass. It does take a period of time for your body to replenish the red cells that have been removed. It's variable from one person to another, but 8 weeks is probably nominal for that.
I know there's all kinds of issues now with who has the flu and this and that, but in normal times, if I have a cold or a fever or something like that, can I donate blood or absolutely not?
Again, it's part of that double-edged sword. We want you to donate feeling well and that we wouldn't harm you by taking the donation. But we also want to make sure that the patient isn't compromised. If the patient is receiving blood, one would have to surmise there's something wrong. And if they're already at a deficit of some kind in their health, you don't want to make matters worse. I did not mention as part of the process of donation that there is a very large battery of tests that are done on the blood that prevent, as much as is possible, the transmission of blood-borne diseases to the recipient. Most of the public knows that we're testing for HIV/AIDS. We test for syphilis. We test for cytomegalovirus. We test for West Nile fever. There's a whole cornucopia of blood-borne diseases that we try to test. You can't actually make the risk of transfusion zero, but we get pretty close.
I take a zillion different kinds of pills and medication. Would I be exempt from giving blood?
One of the things they will ask you is what kinds of medication you are taking. For some medications, it gives the donor interviewer an idea of some underlying health circumstances that would make it improper for you to donate. And there are some medications you can take, and it's not problematic at all. We don't want you to donate if you have serious health concerns. One of the interesting things about the drugs that we take that can or cannot be acceptable is, of all things, aspirin is considered not a drug you want to be on if your donation is strictly for platelets alone, because aspirin interferes with platelet function. But if you're just donating a unit of whole blood, red cells, and plasma, that's not a problem. It depends on what kind of product they're going to make from your donation.
The person has recently had a vaccination. Can they donate?
That's dependent upon the type of vaccination. The only reason I'm being hesitant about it is because it brings back memories. If you ask the donors questions, I used to ask them, have you recently been vaccinated against smallpox, measles, mumps, or yellow fever, or tetanus, or typhoid, or paratyphoid, or cholera, diphtheria, or typhus, or Rocky Mountain spotted fever, or plague, or polio? It's funny how all those things stick in your head. There's a considerable number of vaccines for which we're going to wait a specific period of time before you can donate. There are some vaccines that you may be able to donate within the week or within 2 weeks. It's variable from vaccination to vaccination, and that's why we ask you all those questions. We don't screen for coronavirus because we don't have a test for it that is acceptable to the FDA for the transfusion of blood. Whereas on the other side, I would have said that coronavirus doesn't appear to be a blood-borne virus. In other words, the way you catch it is the way everybody's talking about it, as an airborne virus, not a blood-borne virus.
Could the ink that they use in a tattoo or even ear or body piercing kind of thing, can those people donate?
They can, but there are certain restrictions. First of all, let's take piercings because that's become all the rage in my lifetime. Piercings, if done by a reputable location, that is under standard regulations in the state in which that agency is regulated are acceptable after a certain period of time for healing. The same goes for tattoo parlors. If they are registered with the state and that they undergo inspections and they operate a fine, sterile service, then yes, you can be a donor after a specific period of time. But they do wait a certain period. I believe it's, having been out of the industry since for about a decade, I believe it's about 6 months to a year after you've had piercings or a tattoo. I do not want to misinform your listeners, but I know that there's a waiting period.
What should I do before I donate as far as food, fluids? Like when you go to the doctor, they say, don't eat for 24 hours. Do you have any restrictions like that?
No, actually, instead of restrictions, I would say it's just to ensure that you do your normal activities. We want a donor who is properly fed, in other words, has not been fasting, and we want someone who's well hydrated. If you get up in the morning, have your orange juice, have your cranberry juice, have your coffee. There is no restriction on diet or even having exercise that morning. We want you to be healthy and rested and hydrated.
Now something I'm afraid of. Will I faint when I see the needle or blood? And is there anything I could do to prevent that from happening?
No, I'm afraid there isn't. If you have a fear, and I'm not saying it's an unreasonable fear, of sharp objects, that isn't unreasonable. It is why only 5% of Americans who are capable or eligible of donating donate. And a number of people will say exactly what you said, is they're afraid of the needle. The funny thing about that is I would rather have them insert a needle in my arm and squeeze a rubber ball for 8 minutes than have them do a finger prick. I'm always terrified of those.
Well,
But there are a small cadre of people who can't stand the sight of blood or who cannot abide having a needle inserted in their bodies. And normally I would simply tell them maybe it isn't a very good idea to donate blood, because if you were to faint, which technically we call a vasovagal response, it causes some tumult in the donation center. And we have to tend to you and make sure you regain consciousness and that you feel comfortable before you leave the facility. And we may lose that unit of blood as the result of your unconsciousness. So we would recommend against people who are that afraid from donating.
now a few questions, only because we're in the middle of the virus issue. Is it safe for me or anybody to travel to a donor center?
That is a question I cannot answer because there are so many variables. The donor centers are, by very definition, very clean, and they have sterilized surfaces. So the place itself is not a bad place for you to visit at all. The question today is travel. I don't know how you get where you're going. I don't know what surfaces you're going to touch or have touched. If I knew that I could assist someone, I would probably take the risk of going. But I think that is in the mind of the beholder. Whatever people feel they should do, they should do. We're having a difficult time now getting enough blood units. And I can assure you that if you went to a donor station somewhere in a major blood center or a storefront that's set up for that purpose, everyone there is well aware of protecting patients against disease. But that's a decision that would have to be made by the individual donor.
If your blood isn't needed for a coronavirus patient per se, who's it going to help?
Things didn't just stop in this lockdown. I know you've heard that There are numberless patients who are suffering from the viral disease. But yes, elective surgeries have been canceled, but the world goes on. People become ill. People have accidents. So the hospitals are still full of people who require treatment for other than COVID-19. And for those people, we don't have a comfortable supply of blood. Fully a quarter of the blood that's drawn in this country is drawn through high schools and colleges, and they're not in school. So we've lost at least that volume. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a physician. I'm a clinical laboratory scientist, and my specialty is the field of transfusion medicine. It is the blood bank industry that is poised to provide convalescent plasma because they've already got a 75-year-old system that interviews, examines, and screens donors, and all we would add to it is to do testing to see the strength of the antibody response in the donor. And then we would put them on these various devices that do extracorporeal collection of plasma, and then do the proper testing that we do for any blood product and make that available to the researchers who are doing these double-blind studies that are looking at the efficacy of convalescent plasma. I think it's a terrific idea. It worked during the first SARS epidemic. It worked during the MERS epidemic. And remember, these were only experimental at the time. And it appears anecdotally to be working in the case of COVID-19. So I would really like to see far more studies. And that means as soon as people are convalescent and we test them and find that they have strong antibodies, we are going to draw them. And we hope that they will be kind enough to be selfless and altruistic and make their plasma available.
Thanks for listening to Our Town Live, and don't forget to subscribe and give us a review.